So we already have the first few conversations going on the chat. This is looking like a good start. So allow me to welcome everyone to this webinar from global disruption to innovating in the upturn. My name is Chris. I'm dialing in from Norway. And with us, we have Scott Anthony dialing in from Singapore. And Scott, it's really a pleasure to get a chance to have this webinar. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm thrilled to be here.
I think we have a lot of people looking forward to getting your insights and your perspective on the situation.
I will do my best to offer insights. It is a complex situation that is continually evolving, but as always, we try to look backwards at history, see if we can find some patterns and some frameworks, and try to make sense of everything.
And that's a good start, and I think everyone's looking forward to it. So we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and this is actually the first of a series of webinars we have. We have Scott Anthony, we have Rita McGrath, Alex Osterwalder, Bill Fisher, Rick Rasmussen, all coming up sort of in the next few weeks. And what's unique here is that we've had discussions with each of them to get their insights, not on their general work, but really they're applying their frameworks and applying their theories and applying their unique vantage points to the situation we're in. So Scott, you're the first one out of several, and we're really looking forward to getting those different voices and perspectives. So welcome everyone. We now have a growing number of people dialing in. Now I want to invite everyone to try something out. So we have a significantly uncertain period, but we are looking towards the upturn. So we have actually created the hashtag upturn. We're just going to try it out. So for those of you that want to stay social on Twitter, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, or other platforms, let's try using the upturn hashtag just for this webinar, and we'll see what happens with that. Like always, you can ask questions during, and then we'll maybe try to take some questions along the way, but we'll save up and we'll make sure to cover all the questions towards the end of the webinar. This webinar will of course be recorded, so anything that goes on here will also be distributed out afterwards to all the participants. My name is Chris, founder, CEO of Strategy Tools. I've had a pleasure of working very closely with a number of executives, a number of chairmen of the board, a number of strategy leaders over the last couple of weeks, trying to sort of navigate this disruption. And what's interesting is that when we learn to navigate disruption, we actually look back at some of the both classic and also some of the most recent work. And what's really interesting, just looking at some of the literature that we've been leaning on for the last couple of weeks. Scott, it's really a pleasure to have your perspective and get a chance to introduce you. So Scott Anthony is a really experienced author, consultant, strategist, working with a number of companies across disruption and across transformation. And Scott, I know we've been preparing and you'll be talking about this, but I really, for all of you joining, I want to recommend, if you haven't had a chance to read yet, especially the Dual Transformation, which came out about 2.5 years ago, and also more recently, the How Leaders Delude Themselves About Disruption, which is listed in the recent MIT Sloan Journal. So those two are highly recommended on your reading list. Scott Anthony is joining us from Singapore. He's senior partner with Innosight. He got introduced to sort of Clay Christensen and Mark W. Johnson at Harvard for his MBA, and he's now been really pushing a new generation of thinking, including multiple publications on strategy, innovation, disruption and transformation. And Scott, you're also one of the most prolific writers that we know, and one of the most prolific authors for Harvard Business Review. So I guess that you're taking these quiet weeks, if you will, to get even more time to write, share with everyone. I'll be looking forward.
It's turned out to be a little less quiet than I had thought for a few reasons, but I've been trying as best I can to collate some of the great thinking of some of my colleagues and myself and get thoughts out to the world as best I can.
You know, we have a long line of great thinkers that's been using different quarantine periods and different, you know, plague periods to come up with breakthrough innovations. So we'll see what happens in the next few weeks and months. So what we're going to cover today, I'll set the scene very briefly, and then we're going to have an in-depth presentation from Scott. Then we're going to open for a little bit of discussion, and we're also going to open up with extensive time for Q&A from you guys dialing in. So allow me to briefly set the scene before we get started. So by now, probably most of you, hopefully, have had a chance to watch Bill Gates' TEDx talk from 2015. And it is really fascinating what Bill Gates is telling us and sharing with us in that 2015 talk. And effectively, he says, in the future, it's not going to be weapons of war and weapons of mass destruction that has the potential to taking most lives. It is going to be virus, and it's going to be a pandemic. Now, the question behind that is, were companies supposed to prepare? Were governments supposed to prepare? And there are a great number of people, both across government and business today, that says, you know, we couldn't possibly have known. How were we supposed to have known? How were we possibly supposed to be prepared for this? This is an example of what's happening in a rapidly changing business landscape. This is now one of the risks that companies need to adapt and adjust for. We've been trying to sort of help companies and guide companies through this. So in the last 10 days, we've rolled out a number of new online learning programs, leading to industry shifts, allowing companies to build new scenarios, startup survival, and also corporate survival, helping small companies and big companies to navigate through this crisis based on the insights that we've had. We've seen a pattern. We've seen 3 stages. The first pattern is that people we've talked to, they go into a shock. It's denial. This can't be true. It can't be that bad. Surely it must pass. But now over the last maybe 3 to 5 days, we've seen shock be reduced with cut. And this is a reflex that is well documented. In times of shock and denial, the first action out is cut. But fortunately, over the last few days, we've also seen a growing number of people and companies shifting the conversation from instantly cutting to innovation and transformation. And Scott, this is really where I'm going to hand it over to you in a second. I'm really hoping, and I really want to have your perspectives on this. Are we seeing now the early signs, and maybe how can companies start thinking about moving away from that shock and denial phase, maybe getting out of that immediate cost-cutting phase, and start thinking about how can we innovate for the upturn? That is really the question, and that is, Scott, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It is a pleasure to be here, and it is just interesting to see human ingenuity that is in action in the chat window and the Q&A window. I am here in Singapore. I have just gotten out of 14 days of isolated quarantine. That happened because a couple weeks ago, I returned back from the United States. That actually wasn't what got me put in quarantine. It was transferring through Narita Airport in Japan that triggered what's known locally as a stay-home notice. And my wife and I decided that I ought to isolate just to keep the family safe. So I just got out earlier this morning, and I've returned back to my home here in Singapore. My children, schools are still open here, but my children are doing an experiment in online learning. So I'm hoping the bandwidth is going to hold here at home. My 14-year-old was describing all the shenanigans that he and his classmates are getting up to, including breaking into random Zoom meetings and sending lots of chat messages. So we will try to avoid the noise we see in those windows and focus on the task at hand, which is what can we learn from past big events to give us practical lessons that we can use today to think about innovation and growth. So as we look back at Innosight about what's happened whenever there's been some kind of shock, and that can be an economic shock, that can be a geopolitical shock, that can be a social shock or whatever, there are 2 big things that jump out at us. So let me share my screen. I realized I need to do that before I start clicking through. I was going to do it reflexively. Thank you, Chris, for giving me the power to do it. Let me project this little guy up. And let me note too, to the people that were presenting, I was telling Chris this beforehand, Now, sometimes you do a presentation, which is kind of all your classic songs. You know exactly how the set list is going to work out. You know exactly how long it's going to take. This has a lot of material that I've never presented before. So I'm not 100% sure if it's going to take the 25 to 28 minutes that Chris had in the time schedule. We'll see. I'll try to manage it so that there's plenty of time for actual Q&A from actual people who are not trying to sabotage the conversation. But anyway, the first lesson that we see quite persistently when there's a shock is that change sticks. You know, there's a big debate that's happening right now. When the COVID-19 crisis is over or in a very different place, what's going to happen? Are we all going to go back to normal? Is it going to be like it was before? Are all the changes going to stick? Are we going to boomerang and go the opposite direction? And it's going to be even more hugging, touching, etc. Nobody knows for sure. But I think the thing that you can believe quite strongly is there will be persistent, lasting changes. So you go back to the oil shocks in the 1970s. It helped to drive the small car revolution. That's something that changed the automobile industry for decades. You go and look at the September 11 terrorist attacks, the way that the global travel infrastructure worked changed, and it still has changed today. If you go and look at the global financial crisis, there was a new regulatory infrastructure that was put in place that has had persistent impact on the behaviors that people follow. So I think it is safe to say we don't know exactly what the permanent changes will be yet. You never do in the middle, but we can be very confident that some parts of the change will stick. Now, as we at Innosight have been thinking about how do we make sense of this, the idea that we have is to use one of our tools to at least try to begin to identify what parts of changes will persist. And the idea here that many of you who know Innosight will know is the concept of the job to be done, the fundamental problem that a given customer is trying to solve in a particular circumstance. Now, one of our bedrock beliefs is that jobs to be done are permanent. They don't change. What changes are the solutions that are available that will lead people to get those jobs done in different and better ways. We still believe that, but we also believe that big events can dislocate jobs to be done. And this can happen in one of two ways. One, you can have a temporary change that reveals a better solution that sticks. As a personal example, those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, I've been doing little short posts about my time in quarantine. I am somebody who enjoys regular exercise. I don't like being contained, but I was in 650 square feet for 2 weeks. So I had to try different ways to just get my heart rate up and get moving. And I created something that I dubbed HEBIT, High Energy Billy Idol Time. Billy Idol, who sang the song Dancing with Myself. Put my headphones on, 30-minute dance mix, and the job is done. I'm going to keep doing this, getting out of isolation, because it is awesome. Similarly, in-person meetings, I think, are something that's going to change, because I think we have learned sometimes you absolutely need to be face-to-face, but sometimes the technology saves you all from having to travel, and you can do a really good job of doing something remotely that we didn't really know until we all had to do it. Sometimes there are system-wide changes that are going to not change the fundamental job to be done, but put new barriers in front of you and then change some of the priorities you have. I think we're going to see this in online education as you continue to have people facing constraints on their ability to travel, their ability to gather in mass places. The sudden uptick we see in online education is something that we're going to see that persists. So again, we don't know the answer yet, but we know that change is going to stick, and we know that these job to be done dislocations are the things we want to be watching for. The second big lesson that we learned from previous past events, and the one I'm going to focus on more, is that innovation continues to happen. There is a view sometimes that says when there's a shock, we put our head down, we focus on operations, we focus on the day-to-day. It isn't the time to innovate. But history teaches us a very simple, very persistent lesson. Those who have the courage to continue to innovate, no matter how tough the times are, can do fantastic things. Great companies have been formed, great innovations have been launched in the middle of a downturn. Let me give you one example. Those of you who know Innosight know that we were founded by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Those of you who know Clayton Christensen and know the disruptive innovation literature know that one of his absolute favorite stories is the disruption of the vacuum tube by the transistor. The transistor is born in the 1940s in Bell Labs, a new way to power electronic devices. It is a classic disruptive innovation. It trades off in its early days raw performance for convenience and affordability. It's not good enough to go into mainstream applications like floor standing televisions and radios, so it has to take root in different applications. The first application where a transistor took root was a hearing aid. It was a great market for a relatively limited product. It didn't give off heat, so a much better thing to put in your ear. The fact that it didn't consume power and didn't need to change was a great benefit for that market. Then a company in Japan, the Tokyo Electronics Company, picked up a license to the transistor. In 1955, they introduced their first transistor radio in Japan. It sold about 10,000 units. It wasn't a big hit, but then they introduced their next product. They used the name Sony as the brand name for the TR-63, and they introduced this product in the United States in 1957. And this marks the beginning of a revolution in consumer electronics, of a birth of a great company, Sony, who continues to be great today, about a true industry-wide transformation. And interestingly, when Sony introduced this product in the United States in 1957, we were in the middle of a global pandemic, the Asian flu. It started in China, it came to Singapore, it spread throughout the world. 160,000 people, sadly, lost their lives in the United States. We weren't as good at tracking things then as we were now, but the estimate was 1 to 4 million people died globally. Right in the middle of something that looks eerily similar to what we're going through today, a company took a risk, launched a new disruptive product, and used that to grow to greatness. Now, this is one of the stories that I told in the book that I released about a dozen years ago called The Silver Lining. We wrote this right in the middle of the global financial crisis when people were asking the very same questions they're asking me today. Should we continue to invest in innovation and growth when our fundamental existence is sometimes being called into question? Our argument then was absolutely yes. Our argument now is absolutely yes. We saw in this book, and we continue to see with updated research, that 4 things can happen in the middle of tough times. Number 1, companies that make bold moves can significantly outpace their competitors. Let me focus on Adobe for a second. Shantanu Narayan took over as CEO of Adobe at the end of 2007. Could the timing have been any worse? We have this big economic shock that is coming. We've got the global financial crisis. We've got the Great Recession. Adobe seemingly had its best days behind it. Its business was already starting to decline. Never waste a good crisis, as they say. Narayan and his team launched a classic dual transformation right in the middle of the downturn. 2008, they launched the first web-based version of Photoshop. 2011, they went on to take their entire business and make it a software-as-a-service business. We call this Transformation A, where you're repositioning today's business to make it stronger. 2009, they purchased Omniture. Omniture ended up being the backbone for a new growth business related to advertising services and analytics that today is about 1/3 of Adobe's business. We call this Transformation B, moving your business in a new and different direction. Adobe bought Omniture for a price that was about 40% below its pre-crisis peak. And had they been about 6 months faster, they could have gotten it for 70% below the pre-crisis peak. From Shantanu Narayan taking over to the next 12 years of Adobe's history, the stock price grew 29% a year for 12 years, a phenomenal success story. Second, a downturn can be a great time to launch a startup. It doesn't feel that way because it's so hard, but those that come out of downturns often have deep resilience, which aids their long-term performance. If you go back and look at the global financial crisis, about 15 unicorns were born during that time period, including the cornerstones of the sharing economy and many of the key components of the modern financial system, Stripe, Square, and so on. And we expect you're going to see the exact same thing in the middle of this downturn. Third, as you have consumers focused a little bit more on being cost conscious, it can be a great time to launch things that love the low end. McDonald's introduced its speedy service system, which is the backbone of the McDonald's we know and love today, right in the middle of a downturn. Finally, a disruptive company that's got some traction but hasn't yet broken through this can be the moment where they go and take that leap forward. Back in the silver lining, we named a few companies that are now pretty good calls in hindsight: Alibaba, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Some of the others didn't quite do as well. Enernoc was one that kind of flatlined after the global financial crisis. But our estimate is, had you invested in the companies that we named in the silver lining, you would have beat the market by a 3-fold margin. And we're trying to look right now about companies or innovations that fit this pattern. Maybe it's Amazon's Twitch. Maybe it's some of the emerging digital banks. Maybe it's Box, a online provider of file support and related solutions that are at that moment where they got the foundation and they can take a leap forward. So it is hard, no doubt, but there also are ample opportunities for companies who think and act in the right way. So what do? We're working right now on something that summarizes our view of a playbook through today's uncertain times. The basic argument that we have is that leaders today need to think across 3 time horizons. They have to preserve the present. This is an imperative. You have to focus on this now. You have to trace the tipping points so you are prepared for the inevitable rebound, and you have to continue to think about how you own the future. Let me say just a little bit about each of these, about some of the things that we have written about before, about a tool that you can use to go and do this. And then we'll summarize and open it up for Q&A and discussion. Preserve the present. It's very clear that you can't own the future unless you own the present. You need to make sure that you're operationally and fiscally solvent. That is an imperative. One of the things that many companies are going to have to do is something that they really should have been doing already, which is to turn the zombie projects that they're working on, the innovation projects, the growth projects, that if they were honest about it, weren't going to have material impact. They need to turn those into angels. They need to send them up to heaven. If you followed us before, you know that we've written about this pretty extensively. But as we think about what it takes to actually do this, we've got a few practical pointers for how you can prudently prune your innovation portfolio, and you can do it fast. First, take the emotion out of it. It can be very hard to shut things down, so make sure you've got your checklist beforehand. Get outsiders involved in the process, because people who help to create things cannot be objective about them. I mentioned I've got 4 kids here. I will tell you, as a father, I think they're the best looking kids in the world. An outsider can say, you may think so, but the ears on that 8-year-old, they're a little bit wonky. Maybe other people's kids, not mine. So get outsiders involved. Make sure that you capture the useful learning, because anytime you innovate, 2 good things can happen. Of course, you can successfully launch, but you can also learn something that sets you up for future success. Celebrate that. Recognize it's a good thing. Communicate it widely. And then, as Rita McGrath from Columbia teaches us, provide a symbolic closure. Tell people that you're done and you're not working on this anymore. There are great examples of companies who do this, who celebrate, communicate, and provide closure when they stop things. Tata Sons over on the right gives out a high prestige prize every year called Dare to Try. Over on the left, you've got the Finnish gaming company Supercell, which was acquired by Tencent a couple years ago, doing one of its rituals. We call this Cheers to Failure. Anytime they successfully launch a game, they hold a party, they crack open beer. Anytime they fail and shut a game down, they hold a party and they pop open champagne. It's a better reward for failure than for success, to show people that they need to continue to try to push the envelope, because that's critical to ultimately have the big game-changing successes. So that's the first piece. Preserve the present. You're going to have to do it. Get the team focused on it. Make sure that you prudently prune your portfolio so you've got the resources to get ready for tomorrow. So then the second thing you need to do, go and trace the tipping points. Understand at a granular level what are the signs that suggest things are going to change, and have a rapid response strategy that allows you to succeed in the face of the uncertainty. Now, my colleagues Mark Johnson and Josh Suskowitz are launching this new book, Lead from the Future, in just a couple weeks. This book, if you know Insight, is our deep guide to what we call future back strategy. And that strategy, that approach to strategy, is based on a few simple principles. The first one is you have no choice but to live life present forward. That's just the way the world works. But your strategy work should always be done future back, or else you're going to miss opportunities, you're going to downplay threats. Second, when you're doing true enterprise level strategy, you want to think about scenarios, no doubt, but it's too passive to do scenario analysis. You want to have the courage to choose, plant a flag in the ground and say, this is what we think the future ought to look like. You know the answer will be rough. The metaphor that we use is of an impressionist painting, but demand the assumptions that you're making are precise. The data is always going to be unclear, so you can't have data-driven decisions. Instead, you need data-informed dialogues as a leadership team to align about the way you're going to succeed. And then recognize your strategy is never going to be perfectly formed. You need to monitor, experiment, interpret, adjust, and repeat. Now, that's the general approach that we have for future-back strategy. In the midst of the uncertainty that we're facing today, when you need a rapid response strategy, a few things here change. The first and fifth things stay the same, but numbers 2 through 4 change, and there's a new number 6. Number 2, what you want to do instead of having an answer is understand the spectrum of different things that could happen. And this, rather than being 5 or 10 years out, will be over a very tightly determined time period. You're going to accept that range of answers. You will still demand that you're precise about the outcome determining assumptions that will take you down one path or the other. Instead of the data-informed dialogues, what you really need to focus on here are those dislocated jobs to be done I talked about before. In addition to monitoring, experimenting, interpreting, and repeating, you have to develop the capabilities and culture that will allow you to move more rapidly. This then docks into a recent Harvard Business Review article that I and a few colleagues wrote, and a forthcoming book that we have coming out later this year titled Eat, Sleep, Innovate. The title of that book, the reason why we chose that title, is you eat every day, you sleep every day. There's no reason why you shouldn't innovate every day as well. What we talk about in this article is how do you create habits around the behaviors that drive innovation success. Things like being curious and customer obsessed and collaborative and dealing well with ambiguity. We lay out a pretty simple 3-part process. First, you determine the specific behaviors you want to encourage. We focus on innovation in the article, but you can use the same approach for anything. You want to be more agile, you want to be faster, whatever. Get specific about the behavior you're seeking. Second, understand what's stopping you from doing it. Try to get deep. What are you doing instead of the thing you want to do? What are the systems beneath the surface that are holding you back? Then go and attack those blockers and encourage the behaviors by ripping a page out of the habit change literature and launching what we call beams, behavior enablers, artifacts, and nudges. Let me give you an example of this from the article. One of the focal case studies in the article and the book is DBS, the largest bank in Singapore. The co-author of the article and book, Paul Cobbin, is DBS's Chief Data and Transformation Officer. A few years ago, DBS's CEO said, we can no longer operate like a regulated bank. Instead, we have to operate like a 27,000 person startup. What does that mean? We've got to be agile. We have to be a learning organization. We have to be customer obsessed, data-driven, and experimental. Well, as they tried to figure out what was stopping those behaviors from happening, one place where they pointed the finger was on meetings. They said our meetings are not encouraging collaboration. In fact, only 40% of people said that meetings effectively encourage collaboration. They would start late, they would end later. There were no clear decisions at the end. People would show up to meetings because their calendars told them to. They didn't know why they were there, so they'd be digitally distracted on their phone the whole time. So DBS introduced Mojo. This is a routine, a ritual that DBS now follows in every meeting. The Mo stands for meeting owner. This is the person who calls the meeting to order, who makes sure it starts and ends on time, and makes sure that there's clear outcomes from it. The Joe is the joyful observer, appointed by the Mo to watch the meeting, to make sure everybody's participating, to see if everybody is digitally distracted, to call a timeout, and have a game of phone Jenga where the phones are stacked up in the middle of the table. And then critically, to provide feedback to the Mo at the end of the meeting. This is a great beam, behavior enabler, artifact, and nudge. There's a clear checklist that enables the new behavior. There are artifacts, reminders of these things in conference rooms, and the Joe sitting there serves as an incredibly powerful nudge to encourage the right behaviors during the meeting. Now, in the article and in the book that's coming out, we've got a whole bunch of these things that I will not go through now. but there are tools that you can pick up and use to go and rapidly drive culture change to make you more responsive to the uncertainty we're all facing today. Finally, you cannot lose sight of the future, no matter how critical it is to deliver the present. You have to continue to think about what you can do today to accelerate tomorrow's opportunities. Again, those of you who know Innosight won't be surprised by the core framework here. This is the way we think about identifying the big bets an organization needs to be focused on. We call it strategic focus areas. Ideally, you're looking for something that brings all these things together. You've got an important unsatisfied job. You've got an interesting what that you're targeting. It's sizable. You've got a who that matters. You've got customers out there struggling with this job. You've got at least an idea that's conceivable about how you're going to solve it. And there's a reason to do it. You look at the underlying trends, you look at your capabilities, there's a compelling why. As you're in the midst of the uncertainty of today and you think about your future strategy, you should be thinking about three things. Number one, what are the underlying trends that will accelerate? Can I ask, I'm getting a reasonable amount of feedback. Could we mute the other lines? It's been at the level that is possible, but Chris, if you can mute your line, and yeah, perfect. It's just get up to the level where it was enough that I was losing my train of thought. Thank you. So first, what underlying trends will accelerate? Go back to online learning. I think universities that were thinking they had 10 years to have their online learning strategy now have 2. And they really have to move faster to think about what online education means for them. Second, what new fault lines have been surfaced? We're now understanding in many countries fundamental weaknesses in healthcare systems and preparedness for pandemics. What does that mean? What new opportunities does that open up? Finally, if you're in an organization where you've got a reasonably good balance sheet, this is an incredible time. There are going to be once-in-a-generation M&A options that are opening up. If you don't have a future strategy, if you don't know where you're trying to get to, you're going to miss the things that 2 or 3 years from now you wish that you could have acquired. So even though it's hard to continue to stay focused on the future, it is an absolute imperative, because you don't or can't know what you want to do in 2020 if you don't know where you want to be in 2030, and you're not able to pull that back to 2025, 2022, and ultimately right smack to the day. This places a big burden on leaders today. This is the next to last slide that I have. I will show this slide and then show some bright sunshine and give you my final thought, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But this is what leaders need to do today, we think. Number one, realistically positive. This is a picture here of Admiral James Stockdale. Those of you who read Jim Collins' classic Good to Great will recognize this. He is the person that Collins gave the title Stockdale Paradox to. He was caught in an awful situation. He was in a prison camp in Vietnam for a very long period of time. He wasn't broken, he got out. As he talked about what allowed him to survive that, he said, essentially, I had 2 thoughts in my mind at all times. Number one, I accepted the brutal reality of the present. Today is terrible, tomorrow is going to be terrible. But I never lost unwavering faith that at some point I was going to get out of here. And this is the mindset that we all as leaders need to have. We need to recognize that today is tough, that tomorrow is tough. It's tough for us, it's tough for our teams, it's tough for our families. We need to also recognize that this too will pass. There will be a day where we will hug again, we will high five, we will go to bars, we will go to sporting events. We need to have that realism. We need to have that positivity. Second, we do have to look for the silver lining. We have to find the opportunities and constraints. I got an email that just lifted my spirits from the woman pictured here. She's Helen Eden. She's the CEO of a not-for-profit in the United States called the Settlement Music School. Truth in advertising, she's a family friend. She's my sister's best friend. Settlement Music School runs 6 centers in the Philadelphia area where they teach people classic and jazz music. Now, Helen has been driving a very aggressive transformation over the past decade. She's taken those centers that used to primarily serve children and dramatically diversified them. Adults now come to classes. It isn't just pure music. There's also musical therapy classes that combine together music and physical or psychological therapy, really change the infrastructure. She's also gotten out of the centers, bringing arts into the community in Philadelphia in a deeper area. Now, you might expect the email that I got from her this week was one of despondency. People aren't going to centers. They aren't going to music classes, but it was one of opportunities. She said, you know, I've always wanted to launch the 7th center, the digital center, and now I finally have the opportunity to do this. And music is something that connects people and connects communities, and I am so energized by the opportunity to bring more music to more people. There will be opportunities, whether it's small things like my high energy Billy Idol time, or big things like going digital and driving new things. And as leaders, we need to seek and seize those opportunities. And finally, this stuff is really hard to do. Preserving the present, owning the future simultaneously requires organizations to be able to see above the clouds, to be able to work through some really tough issues. We all need to put a lot of donations in the karma bank. We have to recognize how hard things are and constantly ask, how can I help? We have to, in Adam Grant's language, we have to be givers, not takers. I end with this picture here. This was iStock Photo's finest. I thought it summarized the viewpoint that we have very nicely. It's tough times, no doubt. It is incredible times at the same time. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago that had a lead that I think summarized it well. We look forward in horror. At some point, we will look backwards in awe at the brave, tremendous things that people did, at the brave, tremendous things that business leaders did as they went and seized the opportunities that always exist. They realized the silver lining, they drove transformation and growth, and they created the success story that we'll talk about 7, 10 years from now. So with that, Chris, I'll now open it up to you, and let's have a discussion about the things we talked about here. And that was about, I don't know, 33 minutes, so not too much longer than we had planned for, but let's chat.
You know, Scott, that was pretty much right on time, and I think for the audience also very timely insight and material. As you said, we have some interesting friends with free time on their hands, and they're adding some color to the discussion where you're cleaning that up as we go. But Scott, I want to ask one first question just to open the discussion, and that is, most leaders today most likely have a sensation of being overwhelmed. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of uncertainty. They need to do a lot of different things at the same time. So we're going to sort of focus on what could be the first small step. What would you point to? What would be the first small steps that they could consider?
Yeah, so let me tell you about one of the clients we're working with right now. So this is a big global company that operates in many, many markets and is having to deal with some massive operational issues, not surprisingly. So, you know, we've been helping them think through what is their 2030 strategy, what do they have to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then this just big punch to the gut comes. And the thing we said to them is you've got, let's call it 30,000 employees. And that's not the actual number, but if I told you the actual number, it might reveal who it is. But let's imagine they have 30,000 employees. We said, thought experiment, the future is still pretty important, right? I said, yes, it's pretty important. Can we take 0.05% of those employees and say that you need to continue to think about the future? Yeah, we can probably do that. And that's not very many people. That's all it takes. You know, so as long as you say, let's just take a few people, and we might have 29,994 that are focused on the present, but we got 6 that are still going to focus on. So that's the first thing. Just make sure you tap a couple people on the shoulder and say, we're looking down, you're looking up.
It's a good point and a good starting step. A second question is, based on insights that you have and maybe some of the conversations you're currently having, what would you recommend to the board of directors when the board of directors is kind of going through this crisis? You know, they're in some ways a step removed. They don't have that hand on the wheel, so to speak, but they still have a big role and a big responsibility. So what should we expect differently from the board of directors at a time like this?
So I'll say a couple things. First, you know, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about at Insight over the past few days is just trying to do the best that we can to make sense of what's going on. And you know, of course, The larger consultancies have been throwing out lots of papers and perspectives, which are great and extremely helpful, and I think everyone should digest all of them. We can't match their volume. We hopefully can give different ways to think. That's our comparative advantage. But, you know, one thing we spent some time looking at is, what are the stock markets telling us? What are the capital markets telling us? And the capital markets are telling us the world's not ending. The capital markets are telling us that it's going to be worse for some industries than others. You know, if you're in the cruise ship business and that's your only line of business, it's not a great time right now. But, you know, if you're in the supermarket business, it's a pretty awesome time. If you're in the medical device and equipment business, sadly, to some degree, it is a really good time. If you're in a pharmaceutical, you know, whatever. So the first thing is, step back a little bit and don't read the mass media too much. Don't watch people screaming at you on the television too much. Look for different perspectives to try and ground yourself a little bit in what's going on, because the noise that you can get lost in is so high. I was talking about this with a friend. If we had minute-by-minute updates about the number of just influenza, you know, just basic flu cases, we would never leave our houses. You know, so some of this is just the real-time tracking of things. It gives us this sense of foreboding and being overwhelmed. That's the first thing. The second thing, if I can be self-serving, that I would say to the boards, and there's other ways that they can do this other than reading the book, but they really should all read Dual Transformation, because that is what they need to do as board members. Yes, of course, they have to preserve the present. They cannot have the organization run out of money. They cannot have operations blow up. They cannot have employees be put in unsafe situations. Yes. And it is not harder than that. Just recognizing that organizations have to preserve the present and they have to deliver the future. That need hasn't changed. And the opportunities, again, to do it, this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance. You know, I mean, again, there's lots of bad things. I don't want to downplay that at all. But those boards that think and act like the Adobe board did, like the Lego board did in 2008 when it decided to invest aggressively to go into Asia, like Apple did when it launched the iPod in one recession, the iPhone in the beginning of another. These are the boards that ultimately will get celebrated and cheered. Those that focus only on the short term, I think in some cases they're going to run their businesses into the ground. That's not going to help anything.
That is a clear and loud message to the board right there, Scott. Excellent. I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna bring up the next lineup of questions, and my team is sort of managing that on a case-by-case basis. We're gonna see what that looks like.
Your team has earned its money today. Just I peeked in the question list once and then never went back. But it does very much feel like a bunch of 14-year-olds have got the URL and are having fun. And I desperately hope, Charlie, Anthony, if one of them is you, we were going to have a conversation about this later.
Yeah, we have seen some very interesting, news recently with what's happening in the online education space in that regard, but that's a different story. So let's see, Scott, we're gonna take some questions. We have the first question from Simon Torrance in the UK. How to keep strategic innovation relevant to senior execs at difficult times? I know you touched on it. Do you wanna just give a little bit of a recap for Simon there?
Yeah, so Simon, I would say, and hey, thank you for joining. I would say a couple things. So I think this relentless message that the world's not ending, we need to continue to think about what our future will be. There are great opportunities that exist through all of this. I think that's one component. I think another thing that we haven't talked about is connecting what strategic innovation is to what near-term priorities are, showing that this isn't some esoteric thing that's not connected to anything you're doing. But being able to zoom out and zoom in, I think, is another critical thing. So, you know, again, you talk about 2030, we want to be here, and the specific thing we're going to do today to help us get there is this. So the more that you're able to make that connection point, I think the better it is. And then the third thing, and this is, you know, one of the things we always say when we talk about innovation, we say, you know, one of the thing that great innovators do is they recognize they need to test and learn their way to success. And they recognize that the best thing to do then is don't ask for too much. You know, don't say we need whatever, 100 million euro to launch tomorrow. Rather, we have a really good way to risk mitigate, to go and test and advance. And I made the case in The Silver Lining that one of the reasons why I called it The Silver Lining is the things that you need to do in downturns, loving the low end, being frugal when you go and start new businesses, going and pruning your innovation portfolio, you should be doing those anyway. So all that this time does is it forces you to follow what are generally accepted as good innovation practices. But I think if you can tell that story of the future, you can connect to the present, and you can make sure the requests that you're making are modest, smart, frugal, and focused, I think that's the best thing you can do to keep pushing strategic innovation ahead.
It's a good summary. Next, I want to point you to a question by Chris Sullivan, and I think this is an interesting one. And you've been referring to Adobe. We frequently use Adobe as a case study. It's a very interesting story of transformation right there. So did Adobe know they were being bold, or were they fighting for survival and then pretty much got lucky? There's a lot of writing on Adobe. Scott, what's your take on that question on Adobe?
Yeah, so hey, Chris, good. I guess it'll be good early evening to you. And that wasn't one of the two questions you had emailed me about before. So when the other Chris Sullivan was asking a question, I'm like, oh, great, I know what answer I'm going to give, but that's a different question, so now I have to give a different answer. So my perspective on Adobe, let me give two parts to the answer. I think first, in general, we do, of course, have narrative fallacy. We have survivor bias and all these things. There are other companies that tried to do bold things that didn't work out. One recognizes that there's a limit to the things that we're sharing here. I totally get that. I think in Adobe's case, there's two parts to it. I think they absolutely recognized that what they were doing was bold. I mean, the Transformation A effort, going from packaged software to software as a service, there are a lot of reasons not to do that. And you look at its stock, it took a short-term hit when it announced it, because you look at going from selling software to $100 to getting $5 a month. I mean, that's an immediate hit to cash flow. Now, it turns out that software as a service actually is a superior business model. So once people got that and the financials came in, then of course you had everything go back up. But that was not a risk-free thing to do. I mean, they called it the burn the boats moment when they went to do it, which I think is a pretty good indication that they recognize that this was a dramatic thing. So I do think that certainly this is something that was viewed by Adobe as a dramatic response strategy. And why did they do it on the B part? I think they recognized that the alternative was a long, slow slide into obsolescence. So it's not like the business was going to disappear overnight, but that's not the kind of business that's inspiring to run. So, you know, it is a little bit of take a risk, but it's a risk where the payoff is quite massive. And to this point, too, this idea of innovation and risk, we talked about this in the Sloan Management Review article. There was a CEO who came to an Insight event last year who said something that just, I think, is a perfect encapsulation of the mistake that we make when we make statements like innovation is risky. And what he said is, you know, there have been lots of innovation flops in the world. There is New Coke in the 1980s, Microsoft Zune Player, Google Glasses, whatever. Lots of flops. Those don't sink companies. It is when you invest in innovation, all that you lose is the amount that you invest. The losses are capped. The upside is unbounded, because if you get it right, you create a new ecosystem. When you don't invest in innovation, you know you're getting no upside, and the downside is an existence event, because you can go bankrupt. So what's risky? Is it investing in innovation, or is it not investing in innovation? I don't know.
Well, I think we're both, you know, the two of us and also the audience stands on that question. So we're going to look at the next question from Mikola, and Mikola is probably dialing in from the Ukraine. And really his question goes to, in your view, Scott, what are some of the industries and maybe verticals that are prone for disruption in the near to medium future? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, you know, I think if you look particularly through the lenses of the coronavirus crisis that we're all in now, education is the first one that just springs to mind. You know, Clayton Christensen in 2013 famously predicted that in 15 years, 50% of U.S. schools would go bankrupt. And when he passed away earlier this year, we were halfway through, and it looked like the prediction was going to be wildly off. Maybe he had foresight. He knew that something like this was going to come. But I think that industry is going to see massive changes. I mean, it was already going on. You had the beginning of people who were offering bite-sized credentials that could be stacked into something that looks like a degree. You've got universities doing that, but you've got private companies that are doing it. People are now seeing that distance stuff isn't all that bad. You know, if you're paying in the US $70,000 a year to go to a school that's not providing great things, now you're doing it online, you're like, well, the math just doesn't work. No. So I think the education industry is one where we're going to see just absolutely massive change. Now, we had previously said, but before the downturn, before the crisis, we had said that supply chain and logistics was a space to watch, just as you continue to have big data analytics, you have additive manufacturing, et cetera. I think there's every reason to believe that is another industry where you're going to see massive change. And then the third one I would point to is financial services. Again, you already had big changes as you move to new digital offerings, but as you have this shock of people not going to physical branches and now consuming banking and related services in different ways, banks, insurance companies, I think you're going to see some big changes there. So those are the first three that come into my mind.
Okay. Next question I'm looking at is from a anonymous attendee. It's a question of anxiety, and you know, anxiety is something I've been hearing a lot over the last few weeks, probably as well you. So while we want to be optimistic, and of course we want to look beyond the current crisis and get that recovery, how do we deal with organizational anxiety in that situation we're in right now? What are your thoughts on that?
This is something I will give an answer to it, but I think it's always important to caveat. I mean, we're getting away from an area where I'm an expert or have something where I could say I've got something that there's a reason why I'm saying it, and this is me being a human being. So take that with a massive shaker of salt. But you know, just as we've thought about this within our own Insight community, it is a very real issue. Anxiety at individual, group, team, client level. This is an anxious moment for the world. To me, what leaders need to do is give space for it, to recognize that there is anxiety. Last night, we had a full Insight meeting. We had 103 people all joined via Zoom. We'd never done that before. So we saw 103 faces on the screen. We got into virtual breakout rooms. We just gave space to it, you know, letting people know that this is normal, it's okay. And then coping as groups. You know, what are you doing to deal with the fact that I've got a kid crawling on my lap when I'm in the middle of a meeting or whatever? So I think one thing is just creating a space for it. I think if you think about what we can do more broadly, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how do we create the conditions in organizations where transformation can really happen? And I think if you are to look at that, you really need to have an environment that is characterized by what you might call total safety. So that means that you've got physical safety, you've got psychological safety, like Amy Edmondson might talk about, you've got emotional safety, and you've got mental safety. So you're getting into different literature. This is Brene Brown, this is Kim Scott, this is more of the psychodynamic literature. But I think if we have that type of environment, it makes it easier to have honest conversations about anxiety. You don't feel like you got to hide it. And in the long run, that makes organizations better and also creates space to deal with the anxiety. And the last thing I'd say, you know, just recognizing and trying to help where you can, you know, in big and small ways, you know, unanticipated acts of kindness, just being a good person and say, you know, is there anything I can do to help? You know, we had our IT person, he just home delivered some stuff to people in the Boston area, partially because he was bored and partially because he just wanted to help, you know, just small things like that. Small things. So that's my non-professional answer to the question, which I hope has a seed or two in it that helps.
We also have a question here that may be interesting. Now, Scott, you've previously written about sort of the first 90 days. So here's the question of what do the first 90 days look like for an chief innovation officer or a head of innovation in current times, especially if the focus for the company is somewhere else. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, and a great question when you have the eyes look up means I don't know exactly what the answer is, so I'll have to do a little bit of improvisation. But, you know, I think there's kind of three thoughts that immediately pop into my head. The first thought, you know, if you're just taking over an innovation role, I would be realistic and cut, and say, this is, I got to go and make sure that my portfolio really is grade A material. Because even if you're not being asked to do it, at some point you will. So, you know, better get ahead of it. So number one, really focus the portfolio. Number two, think about what we talked about before, about the story that you can tell about the vital importance of the things that you're working on that can connect into and create space for other executives to say, all right, I understand why we're doing this. So developing that narrative, having that story, I think is a really important thing. And then the third thing that popped in my head is take advantage of the fact that everyone's distracted. I mean, maybe this is the moment where you can do something that pushes the frontier a little bit, because no one's going to stop you. I mean, don't break laws or do anything illegal or anything like that. But, you know, it is a moment where maybe you can get away with something that you wouldn't normally be able to get away with. So take advantage of it. Why waste the distraction, right?
Why waste the distraction? That's a good quote. We also have a question here from Malaysia, from Azim, more on the regulatory side, and that may be a little bit tricky, but I'll frame it and pass it over to you, Scott. So, you know, today we're seeing a lot of regulators adapt quite quickly, especially, of course, on the vaccine part and on some of the breeding apparatus parts. So Azim's question is, how do we get regulators to innovate to allow for new solutions in telemedicine faster than we're currently seeing? You wanna give a shot at that?
It's a great question. So, and one that I think we need the regulatory frameworks in a situation like this. You know, I mean, you have the human cost of COVID-19, but I mean, that very quickly gets swamped by the economic cost, and then the second order human cost from the mental strain that gets placed on people who have not contracted the disease or have contracted and survived. And so that's a lot of stuff to deal with. So I think the idea that we need to be, you know, not put people at undue risk, but be faster and smarter as regulators, I think is really important. The two things that I would say are, number one, go and look at examples in other countries. You know, there was a story a couple of weeks ago where, you know, from everything that you can see, Taiwan has handled the situation incredibly well. And someone from Taiwan said, well, no one's called to ask us what we've done. You know, it's just like, so that's kind of weird. So number one, just get people to look out and see the other things that people are doing, the experiments they're running, some of the people who already had done things, like the Monetary Authority of Singapore that had created a regulatory sandbox for fintechs to create a safe space for experimentation. So that's number one, look out. Number two, I do think the ideas in breaking down the barriers to innovation about ways in which you can encourage the day-to-day habits of innovation, I think that is something that could flow into regulatory agencies or government agencies to get them to get better at things like being agile, being experimental, and so on. It's tricky, you know, because regulators, I mean, the reason why they do the things they do, I mean, they're well-grounded reasons, because, you know, if we rush too fast, you could look at historical examples like thalidomide and other things, the long-term repercussions are really bad. So, I mean, they're in a tough spot too, but I think that idea of global best practice and having some interventions that go and encourage new behaviors inside those agencies, I think could only help.
We've seen some really interesting practices in Europe and also in the Nordics in terms of the speed of collaboration across startups and scale-ups, corporates, and the regulatory framework. And I don't know if that's more accessible in high trust cultures, but definitely getting that regulatory framework into a sandbox environment, if you will, is really important, like you're saying. Scott, we're pretty much on.
Yeah, just the other very quick thing, sorry, Chris. The other thing that just really struck me, this idea of we're seeing these incredibly rapid collaborations. Again, silver lining, the world is filled with ingenious, creative people, and people are having their moments where they are doing absolutely amazing things. We look forward in horror, we will look backwards in awe. I am very confident that is true.
That is a wonderful quote to wrap up with. We are on time. Scott, I wanna really thank you for taking the time today. I know you just got out of 2 weeks of quarantine, just coming back to the family. I want to ask you if you could sort of summarize, the single biggest takeaway for executives. What would that be? And I'm sure you have a lot of good quotes here.
I think the single biggest takeaway from everything we've talked about is keep your head up. You absolutely have to deal with the present. You cannot forget about the future. The opportunities are there. This is the moment for leaders to lead, to seize those opportunities and to own the future.
Scott, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And you know, many of us enjoy the silver lining. And I look forward to seeing what you're going to write following this crisis. So expectations are high, my friend.
Thank you very much. And thanks for everyone for the great questions. It was a real treat to read the chat window. I've never seen anything like that before. But thank you all for putting up with the hackers out there.
Everyone, stay safe. Scott, I hope things are going better in Singapore, and all the best to you and yours. Everyone else, thank you for joining. And our next session is going to be in about 2 weeks' time with Rita McGrath, and then we'll also have Alex and Bill and Rick. So stay tuned. Scott, thank you very much, and have a wonderful afternoon in Singapore.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.